So I think we're pretty aware by now of the many costs of greenhouse gas emissions. But here's just one more. 4 years running now, the World Economic Forum has named the climate crisis as the biggest threat to our global economy. Many petroleum, coal, and gas companies are now saying that some of their reserves are never going to be produced. The head of strategy at BP has said that some of its unextracted oil and gas will never see the light of day. There are a whole bunch of market, policy, and technology factors that contribute to that. Lifestyles are shifting. More companies want to avoid the reputational risks of being associated with fossil fuels. Prices are falling. There are more efficient technologies and alternative energy sources. The fact is that we may have seen peak demand for carbon already. Shell has announced that its oil production peaked in 2019. The fossil fuel sector has experienced a pretty rough string of financial returns over the last decade. In fact, that sector has been the worst performing part of the global economy. Comparatively, within the energy markets, clean energy companies are doing pretty well. In 2020, the largest North American oil company, ExxonMobil, saw its first net loss of over $22 billion. Chevron was in the negative that year too. The year 2021 didn't get much better. On a single day that year, May 26th to be exact, multiple oil and gas companies were dealt huge blows. ExxonMobil lost a key election at its annual general meeting. 3 new board members were elected with majority vote to steer the company in a new direction toward cleaner energy. That day, Shell also lost a key court case and was ordered to cut its fossil fuel production by 45% in less than a decade. And Chevron shareholders also voted to force the company to start cutting emissions. So you can kind of understand why the head of BP has publicly said that we need to make a rapid transition to net zero carbon emissions, and why many fossil fuel companies have been writing down the value of their reserves, because the market's telling them they're not worth as much as they used to be, because the era of fossil fuels is coming to an end. Now, many of those same companies say they're going to lean into renewables and lead the way forward. They've proudly announced that they've quadrupled their spending on renewables and carbon capture. Yeah, they've quadrupled it, up to 4%. As bad as it looks for oil, y'all, it looks even worse for coal. All across the United States, we're seeing the demise of the coal industry. This was the Brayton Power Plant in Somerset, Massachusetts, torn down in 2017 after more than 50 years in operation. It had been the largest coal-fired power station in New England, and it was the last one in Massachusetts to provide power to the regional grid before the state went completely coal-free. Oh, and you haven't even heard the best part yet.
Former coal-fired power plant in Somerset will soon become the state's first offshore wind manufacturing facility.
Here are all of the new coal-burning plants proposed and defeated in the United States over a 15-year period. Here are the ones that have been partially retired or will be by the year 2030. And here are all of the coal plants that have been fully retired or will be by that time. And if you look across the world at the announcements of new coal plants, they're dwarfed by the announcements of plants that have been canceled or put on indefinite hold. In South America, the head of one coal company said, we thought the coal market might disappear at some point. We always saw that as the future. Well, the future is now. 92% of all the new coal projects planned or under construction worldwide will never earn back the money it takes to build them. It's why so many are being canceled at such an early stage. Here's an example in Australia, where their newest $1.2 billion coal-fired power plant was closed just after it was finished, written off as worthless, because the electricity from renewable sources is cheaper and it made no sense to run it. So why then is it so damn hard to quit fossil fuels? One reason it's hard to move on is because of the political power of fossil fuel companies. Companies in the fossil fuel industry are leading campaign donors and lobbyists. The world's 5 largest publicly owned oil and gas companies spend around $200 million each year on lobbying to control, delay, or block climate policies. In 2022, they spent another $24 million on donations to political candidates for Congress and Senate. And in this particular case, they've gotten pretty extraordinary return on their investment in politicians and policies. Because as taxpayers, we subsidize fossil fuels at a rate 42 times more than meager encouragements for a faster transition to renewable energy. The increasingly poor return on investment in fossil fuel energy is one of the reasons why so many financial institutions around the world have stopped investing in coal-fired power plants. 200 global financial institutions to date, and counting. The Asian Development Bank went one step further, paying countries to shut their coal plants ahead of schedule while also supporting green alternatives. In Vietnam, they funded $37 million for the first large-scale floating solar power plant, the largest of its kind in Southeast Asia. In 2021, the G7 countries committed to stop financing all exports of coal-fired power plants. Who even knew we exported our coal plants? They also agreed to stop providing aid for coal plants in developing countries. China has too. Look at Poland. You remember them, historically the largest coal-burning country in Europe. Well, they announced that they're going to completely phase out production of coal over the next 30 years, and they're coupling that with support for all the people who work in that industry. Can we talk more about that for a minute? A lot of the argument against transitioning from fossil fuels is about jobs and the impact on people who work in mines and other fossil fuel-related industry. And that seems fair. They're not the ones to blame for the climate crisis. But that argument is so simple-minded.
I am consecrating, but nothing's happening.
Because it's not an either-or option. It can and should be a both-and. We can make a transition to clean energy, and we can provide extra support and new opportunities and training for folks as part of that transition. If you don't believe me, just look at the numbers of new jobs being created in renewable energy. In the United States, there are 5 times as many jobs in solar as there are in coal mining. Already, 13.7 million people have jobs in renewable energy around the world, and worldwide, jobs in green technologies pay wages nearly 7% higher on average than jobs in polluting industries. The highly respected Oxford Review of Economic Policy found that dollar for dollar, 3 times more jobs are created in renewables and energy efficiency than money invested in old, obsolete fossil fuels. So here's the thing. We can resist change, or we can embrace it, even lead it. But no matter what we do, change is coming. But here's the kink. You know how the Russia-Ukraine conflict exacerbated food insecurity? It's also been a real stinker for the global energy transition. The United States banned Russian fossil fuels as part of sanctions against them for the invasion.
After weeks of discussions, EU leaders have agreed on an immediate partial embargo of Russian oil imports.
Europe also established sanctions, and they pledged to stop oil imports from Russia immediately and gas imports by the year 2030. Well, Russia, they didn't wait for 2030. They slowed and eventually stopped gas imports to Europe through the Nord Stream pipeline. It was a big deal because Russia supplied 40% of the European Union's energy supply. The scramble to replace Russian fossil fuels has also led some countries to walk back their commitments to fight climate change. Several countries in Europe have paused on plans to shut down coal plants or fired back up some of the plants that they'd previously closed. That G7 agreement not to fund overseas coal plants that I mentioned before, Germany's been lobbying others to reverse it. Fossil fuel companies are seizing the moment and rallying for more gas and oil development than ever.
Unfortunately, there's no quick fix, but in the near term, the answer is straightforward. If we want to reduce prices, we need to increase supply.
They've been pretty successful in shifting the narrative from energy transition to the need for energy independence. And by the way, they've been getting rich doing it.
Exxon made more money than God this year.
ExxonMobil made $23 billion in 2021. Its highest profits in 7 years as gas prices for consumers soared. And what did they do with the profits they earned? They gave them back to wealthy shareholders with stock buybacks and dividends. Remember that commitment the fossil fuel industry made to increase investment in green technology by 4%? Well, the actual amount of their spending that's gone towards solar and wind is only 1%. In the last couple of years, they've been cutting down on the little bit they have been spending on renewable energy and increasing the amount they're investing in fossil fuels. So, safe to say they aren't going to be leading change. I think we can all agree we want energy security so we're not in a scramble. But let's not do more of the same thing that got us into this mess in the first place.
Drill, baby, drill.
Now more than ever, we should be investing in renewable resources for energy independence. The head of the United Nations was much more blunt in his assessment. Countries could become so consumed by the immediate fossil fuel supply gap that they neglect or kneecap policies to cut fossil fuel use, he said. This is madness. Addiction to fossil fuels is mutually assured destruction. So yeah, there's also that. In history, there have been other civilizations that reached a turning point where their treatment of the environment was concerned. They made the wrong choice and disappeared. This photo is from Easter Island in Chile, where the Rapa Nui were believed to have lived over 500 years until the population collapsed around the 18th century. The long-held theory is that the society essentially destroyed itself by overexploiting its own resources. As we face our turning point, we can embrace change or we can resist it. Let's make the right choice.